We're glad to have you here. All right, here we are with another episode of Coffee with the Founder. I got my coffee cup, and of course, we have another phenomenal guest here, Natalie Thoreson. And Natalie, what we're trying to do is just introduce people to our WPC community, the work they do, who they are, how they got started, all those kinds of things. And so we appreciate you joining us. Let's start with that question. Who are you? How do you introduce yourself to people? How do you explain to people what it is you do, the work you do, the work you've been doing? Can you just let folks know who we have here with us today?
So my name is Natalie Thoreson. I am a founder of Envision Consulting, and I use the pronouns she, he, they. I'm really flexible around my pronouns, but I do try and take a moment to share that with folks because I think it's important to make space for that. As far as what I do anti-oppression design and facilitation. I run workshops across the nation for groups of folks. Any who do you work with, and honestly, I'll work with anyone that's interested. Mostly adults at this point. Startups, banks, nonprofits, any kind of people that are interested in looking at the ways that oppression impacts their work teams, the way that, power and privilege around race, as well as sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, etc., how all those things impact our interactions with one another, and then ideally how we can actually work to shift and change some of those things, right? Because I think it's one thing to know about systems of oppression. It's a tools to engage conversations around it. I would say one of the big things that quite a few folks know me for at this point around the nation is actually some work that I've done around just how to have conversations, everyday conversations with people when people say and do things that are oppressive, because what I find most of the time is that people aren't intending to do those things. Now that intention doesn't relieve them of the impact, right? But unintentional racism, unintentional sexism, we need to have a way to talk about it that doesn't immediately throw guilt and shame and blame, but instead opens things up for folks to unpack their learning and their history so that they can actually actively work toward change.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you about how you respond to someone who's willing to do some of that anti-oppression interruption. All right. I want to ask, what would you say to a parent or to a student even, or adult, young adult? So I want to get you thinking about that. But before that, I wanted to know, is Envision Consulting anti-oppression work? Is this what you grew up hoping you'd do someday? I mean, how'd you get on this path?
I grew up wanting to be an astronaut, Not the same thing. I actually found myself, I ended up in a mechanical aerospace engineering program in college, perhaps related to some things around oppression. And that's a story that I talk about in some of my trainings. I think that I was guided that direction based on an assumption that I had math and science skills and interests, and being Asian, et cetera. At any rate, I was partway through my program, decided that it wasn't for me, ended up with degrees in psychology, with minors in English and women's studies, but without a lot of direction, really. And a friend of mine, one of my shout outs, Ruth Hackford Peer, reached out to me because she had been accepted to the social justice education program at UMass Amherst. And I know you're familiar with a bunch of people out of that program, right? We're all over WPC. And so when that happened, I applied to the program and headed back to Western Massachusetts. And it was a really good fit. I think based on my life experiences growing up as somebody at the intersections of race, at the intersections of sexual orientation, gender identity, and really being in borderlands in a lot of those places, it was really easy for me to understand a lot of the theory. So it came pretty naturally. And I've always been a talker. That was something that was there all along. So putting all those things together, that is how I ended up doing the work. And, you know, I talk to a lot of folks now that are in middle school and even elementary school that have a desire to do this kind of work growing up, but I didn't even know it was a possibility.
Mm.
So,
Yeah, yeah. Now, Malcolm Gladwell talks about 10,000 hours. That's the amount of time essentially he researched and talks about that you really need to become a professional, you know, to reach the highest level of your profession. I mean, when did you feel like, okay, I'm going to do this for a living. I'm going to do this on my own. Was there a moment that it hit you, or did it just kind of talk a little bit about that?
yeah, people ask me that because, you know, also there are folks interested in doing this as a job, being a consultant specifically. And I have to say, my life path has not been the same path that a lot of people have. When I moved from Western Massachusetts to the Bay Area, I had a job with the National Conference for Community and Justice out there, running a summer camp and doing the work for a company. When I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area in 2006, I couldn't find a job. I couldn't find a job doing what I did for a company. So I was forced to start consulting. And I wasn't long out of school. And, you know, on the early years, I hustled. I just picked up every single little bit of anything, you know, free gigs where I might get $50 for a day, and really, really put on the hustle on the front end. And that is what slowly, I guess, sort of worked me up to the point I'm at now. But a lot of it was relationship based, and it was very, I don't know if accidental is the right word, but organic maybe,
Mm.
right? It wasn't something that I planned out. I didn't have a business model. I didn't have connections even, but it was really just about taking the work when I could. And I like to believe that I have a particular skill in connecting with folks in different spaces and identities. I think it's the chameleon aspect of a lot of us biracial folks and multiracial folks. And so being able to do that got me there.
Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna come back to that a little bit, but first I want to go to that question I had set up earlier. I mean, I want to know how to stop the unintentional
Hmm.
from doing the kind of harm that they do. What are the pieces of advice you would give to folks who want to know, not the most resistant? I'm saying folks who are willing
Yeah,
to grow and interrupt. What's your advice to
sure.
folks? How do you help them out with that?
Hmm. I mean, and I'm not sure if you're asking, because I think there's two different pieces to the question. I'm not sure if you're asking, how do you handle somebody who has done the thing, right? The oppressor essentially in that space. Um, or what is the advice that I give to a person who wants to handle the oppressor? And it's similar information, but I think that I probably have a much deeper skill set than somebody who's just starting to learn how to do it. So I guess on the most basic level, the thing that I would say for folks, and this is so important because we always look outside ourselves. If you're in that moment when somebody says or does the oppressive thing, right? For Asian folks or for mixed race folks, it might be the "where are you from?" For the person who is Black or African American, it might be, "Oh, you are so eloquent when you speak," right? Those little things, which can add up to really big, painful moments. When we hear those things and they land on us, when somebody says to me, "Oh, where are you from?" and they haven't even gotten my name yet, the first thing I have to do is calm myself,
Mm.
right? That's actually the key. If I come at that person like, "What is your effing problem?" then that's just going to set everything up in a negative frame. So I have to figure out how to calm myself, which is hard. And I've a lot of folks, as soon as I say that, will ask, "Well, why is it my responsibility to be calm in this moment with this person who's just done this thing that is attacking me or harming me or whatever?" And it is a very hard thing to wrap around. But the reason that I calm myself, the reason that I find a way to actually approach that moment with thoughtfulness and even with love and compassion, is that if I don't, the change won't happen.
Mm.
Right? When does attacking someone make them change? It just doesn't. I think that for a lot of years, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of this, Eddie, I think that social change movements, and especially anti-racism movements, they've been about blaming white people, right? Villainizing white people, demonizing white people. And that doesn't help white people want to make change, right? When people villainize me or demonize me around anything, it doesn't make me want to make change. And so as hard as it is, and as much as it shouldn't be my job to stay calm in that moment, if I can stay calm in that moment, if I can find some love and some compassion in the engagement, then I can actually be somebody who speaks from a voice of actually maybe making change. Another piece, and one of the ways that I keep myself calm, is I remember that as much as I might be receiving microaggressions as a queer person, or as a genderqueer person, or as a person of color, mixed race person, I also create those oppressions for other people, right? As an able-bodied person, in my privilege, I know that I say and do things that are oppressive. And if people attack me, I think I know enough now, and I'm far enough in the journey. Like, if I did get attacked, I'd still probably take that as a lesson and move forward. But when I was first starting on those journeys, again, the attack wasn't going to help me even want to think about what was going on.
Mm-hmm. When you were talking about the things you're known for and the things you do really well, I had anticipated the response around the work you do with people of color. And some of those workshops. But I do think it's worth mentioning, and I'd love to have you talk about what is that work around diversity, inclusion, anti-oppression that you've been doing specifically with people of color as it relates to either handling, interrupting. Can you just talk a little bit about that work?
Definitely. I mean, but the first thing I do have to say is all of the other stuff is related, right? When I'm doing anti-racism work, I'm also, it was Audre Lorde. So Audre Lorde in No Hierarchy of Oppressions is the article. It talks about went away tomorrow. As a queer woman, she's still going to be oppressed, right? So a Black queer woman will still be oppressed even if racism goes away tomorrow. So that's just something I keep in my frame all the time, because I think these things are so interconnected. When it comes specifically to anti-racism things, language is hugely different, but I do know that the energy is a lot different, because racism is that oppression that brings up, right, all of the feelings. When some of the language that folks out there use around race, the N-word, or, other derogatory terms that folks may use around race, they bring up a lot more than maybe words around sex and gender, like the B word, right? So I think that that's a big piece to think about and manage, is that it might be more triggering. It might be something that causes more of a visceral response. And also because it's so highlighted in our larger society. But as far as actual things to say, right, after calming oneself, for me, I try and get more information, find out where the person's coming from before I jump to whatever conclusion. Ask the person to tell me a little bit more about what's gone on. Tell me more is a great question to use. And then once I've gotten a frame by doing that and calming myself during the time that they're sharing, being able to say to that person, I don't think that you intended it this way, but when you said that, all Asians are good at math, or that Black people don't care about education for their children, whatever statement, when you said this thing, it hurt my feelings. It made me feel uncomfortable. It made me upset, right? Even it made me angry. But then framing my feelings around what the statement that the person has said brings up or creates for me. And it does something to open up a conversation in a different kind of way.
Yeah. That's helpful. I wanted to ask you a little bit about, you had been saying and mentioning biracial, multiracial, and I'm wondering, kind of what's the role of multiracial identity and biracial, I mean, as you mentioned, the language, people are mixing that all up. I mean, what's your sense of where we are as a nation in dealing with multiracial identity? I think about Obama as an example, where people kept saying the first Black president, although
Yep.
he carried biracial, multiracial identity. And I think it just warrants some discussion and questions. So I'm just wondering, what's your sense, your thought around where we are in reference to the work you're doing anti-oppression and multiracial, biracial, cross-racial?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of my roles, and I can't talk for all people, right? I think that's important as well. But I think one of my roles, mixed race person, and specifically because half some of my 100% on one side of my racial mix is white. I think that folks like me who grow up in those spaces and who grow up with a certain lens of whiteness, I believe it's my responsibility to use that, right? Like, I grew up speaking the native language of people of color and of whiteness, to navigate and move through things in a different kind of way than a lot of folks. I don't think that it's as taxing for me as it might be for a person who is not mixed race person of color to code switch into things, right? Because I've been code switching since I was born. So I think that that's an important role for folks, if you have the language, if you have the knowledge. Now, that's different if you're a mixed race person who is maybe Black and Asian, or right, two people of color, mixed race identities. I think it becomes a really different thing. But I think if you have whiteness, I know what it's like, and I use this as a tool, and folks who have been in my sessions have heard me joke about the fact that, they're looking at an Asian woman, but really I know how to be a white man, right? Because I know how to speak in that kind of tone. I know how to carry myself. I think there are a lot of ways that I take after my white father. So yeah. Does that answer any of what you're asking?
Well, it's just, I mean, so much there. I mean, that's just so
Mm-hmm.
helpful, the nuggets you dropped there, which makes me want to ask you about this this time of quarantine, COVID-19, and specifically the impact on Asian Pacific Islanders, with the kind of pinpoint assignment of this pandemic to a group of people.
Oh yeah, the Chinese virus, is that the one you're talking about?
Exactly. So, but what I find is people can't tell people apart anyway. So it feels like it's a sweeping net that was laid out. So what's your sense of where we are and what we possibly could expect? Because people are saying there's been a increase of attacks and racist acts towards Asian Pacific Islander folks. And again, I don't think that just means Chinese folks, because often I find folks sweep folks in a blanket. So what's your sense in reference to?
I'm actually running a workshop next week on the impact of COVID virus on Asian American populations. And there has been a huge increase in violence and hate crimes and all these things. The biggest thing that I think is pointed out and highlighted is that although people like to put Asians in this position of power when it comes to folks of color, right? We play this weird oppression Olympics, skin people, and right, and the Asians have some power over here, and all those things. Although those things can be true in certain spaces, in reality, folks of color are still folks of color, right? The myth of the model minority was created in the 50s as they were bringing in educated Asians to fill right? They're like, we need some immigrants, but we're only going to let these ones in. They didn't just let any Asians come. They let Asians with doctoral degrees, right? Advanced education come into the country. And it was also this beautiful tool that could then be used to turn around and look at Black folks, look at Latina folks and say, look, these Asians could do it, right? These people are brown too. You all must not care about education. You all must not be trying hard enough because look how well they're doing. So Asians kind of got framed in this space of, this crosshair of being stuck. I equate it to the creation of a middle class, right? When you only have wealthy people and poor people, there's no buffer that happens in between. You need a middle class. The middle class aren't much better off than poor folks. And I think you can look at it the same way when it comes to construction around race and racial identity. Asian people were held up just a little bit, but in this moment, with this virus going on, the Asian just becomes another dirty chink, right? I was thinking that would be such an interesting piece of title for a WPC workshop, because there's a way in which the model minority really quickly and easily deconstructs and crumbles right back into just being another person of color. So it's a really interesting time, and I don't love that anything is happening to anyone around the country or world around the COVID virus, but it does make me feel a little bit of validation in, understanding of knowledge around this stuff. And people now, I don't think being able to say, oh, well, Asians, they don't really count. I've had people ask and tell me that folks out in the world ask them, are Asians really people of color? Right? I think this moment proves that, how quickly folks just shifted into being targets.
Yeah. Well, just can you talk a little bit about what you see is in reference to how people are doing during this time, this quarantine time? We had talked a little bit before we came on about, kind of the situation you've been in, and maybe little unique for most folks, but as you're back now settling in and of course talking and listening to folks, first, what do you see happening there in the Bay Area and how folks are doing in reference to COVID-19? And what has this pause, this what I call this moment, the nation has essentially had the pause button pushed and possibly shine the spotlight on where we are, particularly as it relates to healthcare. What does this time tell you about where we are as a nation around the issues that you deal with, you grapple with, you teach about, so on and so forth?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned earlier, I'm just coming back into the Bay. One thing I want to mention is that, I spent about a month and a week, 5 weeks on Kauai. And I do want to give a shout out, because what I saw happening there is that the entire community was so open to embracing social distancing, curfews, wearing masks. And they do it for their kapuna, which is the word for elders, right? And there is a strong community lens where folks just care. And that's the one thing in talking to friends and colleagues that I have here in the Bay and throughout the nation, I don't know that people really understand that taking care of themselves is actually protecting their communities. Right? I am so disappointed in people's reluctance to wear masks, because we've seen people in China and Korea and Japan and how quickly they took to wearing masks. And I have family in South Korea. They haven't had the level of having to shut things down, right? They haven't had to close the economy in the same kind of way, because they were quick to take social distancing and, more importantly, mask wearing into play. When I hear about and look at and think about the Bay Area, we just had regulations put in place, I think maybe starting today, but they just announced it like 3 days ago, maybe, saying that people had to wear masks in any public place. It's unfortunate that it took so long, But even before, it was mandatory in Kauai, people were doing it just because. And the governor of Kauai had this beautiful message on the radio that said, my mask protects you, your mask protects me. Um, that's what I'm not sure that we're seeing in places like the Bay Area. It's also a little bit different, and I can't say that I didn't miss a little bit of this, but you can have just about anything delivered here. I know there are some places in the nation where that doesn't happen. So as far as folks who are in that industry doing delivery work, et cetera, they still have some work. But I have a lot of friends, if you're in the tech industry, et cetera, people are still working from home. All those things can go remote. But I have a number of friends in community that work in the service industry in different ways. As you probably know, a lot more of those people tend to be folks of color who lost their jobs really early on. So I think that's a challenge as well. There's been forgiveness programs for, mortgages here, and people asking the banks to put payments on hold, but our landlords aren't putting rent on hold, right? So, and who owns a house versus who rents a house. But again, I'm just back into this, so I haven't, I do, as I look out the window here, we live on the third story. I do see people at the crossroads here as they're walking to and fro, either wearing masks, have them around their neck. Not as many people moving around. So all those impacts. But, what I really worry about is, and even the name of it is tough. I know a lot of people are talking about physical distancing versus social distancing. But I think there's definitely a way when we force ourselves apart from people, it feeds the potential for fear and oppression.
Yeah.
So that it'll be interesting to see where that goes. I don't know, but I worry about it.
Yeah. And it's again, as I mentioned to you, I'm often being asked and asking people how you're doing, and I'm not sure we really even know because there's no really measurement. But I do know when I can't communicate, hug, touch, I mean, it has an impact. But I do think that, coming from that kind of community, I've been asking people, and I'd love to hear your response around this, social distancing. I think that's a Eurocentric cultural value. That's not new. I mean, I live in the suburbs, right? And now I've been here more days than I've been in a long time. And so
Yep.
I'm thinking to walking around the community and see people walking around and they wave and they say hello, but we don't really know them. We don't even know their names. And we've been here almost 3 years, right?
Yeah.
It's almost like the culture here is one of social distancing, to your point that, I mean, I don't know how much that's fostering this fear, but I think with some of these aspects of our nation and our news pointing towards the Chinese virus, pointing towards people of color being more affected, particularly Black folks. Now we're seeing immigration, and some real punitive and just devastating kind of policy being applied. I think you're right. I mean, I think there's some real concern we have to pay to, we have to give some attention to in reference to what's that gonna do. But in a city like your city, where, I mean, you can look at the window and see people in need. I can't see that here in Green Bay. So do you have a sense of like how the urban center, big community spaces like an Oakland or San Francisco, you have a sense of how this time is going to have an impact on them over the long term?
I mean, I think the financial impact is going to be the biggest. I live in the area of Oakland that has definitely been more gentrified. And my partner and I have watched that gentrification over time. And again, that base of fear, I think that fear is the reason people don't say hi when they're walking down the street oftentimes. And the more that the population tends to shift to people who aren't from here, people who tend to be more white, right, then fewer and fewer people say hi. And I do a lot of work, you know, on my car and whatnot outside. And I've noticed that over the years, people walking by, I'll look up and say hello. They know I'm there. They've seen me as they approach, like I'm out on the street doing work, and that they'll be right next to me and I'll say hi, and then they'll act all surprised, like they didn't know a person was there. So I don't know if there's an invisibility that gets created or if they're just ignoring so hard. Um, my friend Mars, who lives further into East Oakland, um, which definitely is not gentrified in the same kind of way. It is mostly folks of color, Mexican folks, Black folks, immigrant Asian folks, that a lot of refugees, etc. And in my buddy Mars's neighborhood, what they were saying is that, you know, folks are still gathering, people are having events, people are having parties. And I think a piece of that is lack of education around self-protection, right? And not really knowing, because, you know, to turn on the TV, the government doesn't explain what a virus is, right? Even why 6 feet of social distance does something, that it's traveling through, you know, they're talking about droplets and all this other stuff. If they just said it's the spit from your mouth when you sneeze and it goes in someone else's nose, I think people would understand a lot more what's going on. But they've overcomplicated it in kinds of ways that, you know, using education again as a tool against communities of color, I think. I think that that's what's creating where folks of color are more hard hit, or people not knowing, you know, what symptoms to watch out for, right? All these different pieces. I don't know what that's going to do to communities in the long term.
Yeah.
The financial impact, though, you know, it could, and I try and think about positive things. It could, and I've seen some in the area. It may create a forced change around, you know, the way that rent works here, because we could get to the end of this and we might have, you know, a quarter of the population not able to pay bills. And then what do? Something has to shift or give. You know, corporation letting it sit empty, that's probably going to have to shift.
Yeah. Oh, lots of good stuff there. Lots of good stuff. I feel like we could be here another half hour, but we got to get towards the end. I wanted to ask you about your next 10 years of life as you look ahead. What's on the horizon? Anything you're excited about? Anything you're working on? What do you foresee Envision Consulting, Natalie Thoreson, the next 10 years?
Yeah. I mean, you know what, Eddie? I would just be thankful to keep doing the work that I'm doing. You know, as I talk, it was a little bit accidental that I got to the point that I'm at, and I am deeply thankful for it. I'm thankful for connections that you've provided, other people have provided, mentors that I found along the way. And so just to be able to continue doing this work and connect with people, I'm starting to get to the point, or I have in the last little while, where people are reaching out to me to do some mentoring for them, and that feels really good. You know, getting to the space of large scale social change is my hope and dream. I don't know that that's going to happen in the next 10 years, but I think that more people can come on board. I think that being part of that is where my heart lies. And with that, I think it's about community, because that's where my connections are. That's where I find love. That's where I find people able to see me for myself and beyond the labels and identity, right? When people talk about, you know, why can't we all just be one race in the human race? I would love to get there, Eddie. But we got to get past all the oppression first, right? We got to get past all the power and privilege and white supremacy. And those are the things that I'd like to keep doing and working on. And I'd like to keep having fun, keep traveling, keep meeting new people, keep fixing things, keep eating hamburgers. Yeah. People who know me will understand some of that. Yeah.
Well, I want to ask you a little bit about some fun stuff, but before I get to that, to close out, I was going to ask you, as you mentioned, coaching, working with future consultants, possibly. This could be an opportunity for you to speak to thousands of future consultants. What would be your short message to them as you've come about this organically, so to speak, or divinely, possibly? Um, but what is your piece of advice as you think about, kind of the way you've come to be the high level consultant and skilled facilitator that you are, as you're advising the future of this work? What's your piece of advice to them to help them get started, or they should be thinking about as they look at the next 10 years of possibly doing this work?
Sure. Um, that's a big request. Let me see what I can. I mean, I think remembering that people are good. I'm definitely a person who believes in tabula rasa, right? Blank slate. We come into this as good, and we learn oppression. In order to unlearn oppression, we have to understand and believe that it was learned. And I think for me, that's a big piece in being able to be compassionate and empathetic and loving toward people who may be doing and saying some things that come out real hateful, things that aren't great to listen to or hear. But I think it's a space to make change, making connections with folks. I think is super important in the work. I think that, and you know this, I'm very sure, right? When you facilitate, sometimes you have to swallow up a lot of your feelings. Somebody may say or do something and you just want to tear them apart in the moment and you can't. And it's important to be able, as a facilitator, as a consultant or practitioner, it's important to be able to push those things down, but you also have to find time and space to let those things back out, right? Because it will eat you up from the inside out if you don't make room for it. And it'll either just make you apathetic and you give up on it all, or it'll make you hateful and resentful. And I think you can't do the work from that space. So yeah, knowing that people are good, there's my short answer for that. And then also finding space to recharge and be together and be around those folks who you don't have to facilitate, those people who you don't have to put on any kind of a mask or a code switch for, and be really seen and rejuvenated with.
Well, you delivered on that tall order. I appreciate that. That was really concise, but also powerful. And I think that's what we're trying to deliver for folks in this time we're with them. Let me ask you to help us with our what to watch list. We're trying to create a list of things that people have watched, streamed, that maybe they've learned something from, or something that's just helped you to kind of laugh or get away. Is there anything you would recommend that you've seen recently for our list or in the past?
Oh boy, there's so many things. I'm not good at remembering names of things, but if it's okay, what I'd like to do is give a what to read, because I think that's important as well.
Absolutely.
You know, if folks haven't gotten their dose of Octavia Butler yet, I think Parable of the Sower would be an interesting thing to read right now in this time. It's fiction, but it's about the world sort of being in crisis, run out of water, right? The politics have gone sideways. People are after each other. And it's about surviving that in community and what that looks like. Yeah, Octavia Butler's huge for me. And then I've actually been reading N.K. Jemisin. I hope that I'm saying her name right. But the 5th season, it's more stuff. I like to read fiction, but it's fiction by, those two are both by Black women, and the lens that they're looking at things through doesn't just look at, fiction for fiction's sake. It looks at fiction in the eyes of systemic oppression and social change and community and all that stuff. So those are things that I would encourage people to look at. Also, we got to get off our TVs a little bit. I know a lot of us are staring at them for way more hours a day than we used to. I'm not even a big reader, but I'm reading a lot now.
Well, that's helpful and a reminder to me moving forward to offer some other option outside of screen time. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
And so I will broaden that request, and we will add to Xiaowin Lo. Dr. Xiaowin Lo also recommended some books, and so this is just another consistent reminder. We got to expand that. So thank you, Natalie. Always a pleasure to have you and see you. I wish I was able to hug you. So
I know. Give like a virtual, give a virtual, hug it out.
Give you a little Wakanda, hug it out. But in the meantime, stay safe. Give my best to the fam. I'm glad you're back home in the Bay, and we'll look forward to staying in touch. And thank you for your time.
All right, sir. You have a good one, Eddie.
All right. Appreciate you.
Take care.